But a lot of the companies are now.
You're ready, I'll do it.
Oh,
yeah, very good. Thanks, everybody, for coming out tonight. I'm Tom Richards. I serve a couple of roles here at the library. I'm secretary on the Friends of the Library Board. You may be familiar with the Friends. They, through fundraising projects, including used book sale, help to fund projects that the library couldn't otherwise fund with their available funds. And I also have taken on a couple days a week helping out at the information desk in the adult section of the library. So if you come in with a question of who or where or how, I might be able to help. And so tonight we're going to learn from Tom Asp. Tom, for over 40 years, he's been helping utilities with expertise in automation, planning, implementation, financial analysis, and all in the rapidly changing electric utility environment. And tonight our topic is the current state of electric utility business and renewable energy realities. And we'll learn about the efforts toward transitioning away from fossil fuels with the goal of reducing carbon emissions through renewables such as solar, wind, hydro, and there are even some newer aspects of that too. So, but it's complicated, and we'll learn about the structure of the energy delivery market and the advantage and disadvantage of some of these renewable options and what needs to be considered as we go through this transition. So with that, welcome, Tom.
Okay.
Thanks very much.
Yeah, thank you. And I gotta kind of reiterate one of the things as Tom was giving my background. I think I want to stress here is that, yeah, I've been working in the electric industry for 45 plus years. I've not been on the generation side. I'm working on the automation, fiber optics, radio communication, data collection. That's more where my expertise. So a lot of what I talk about is learned through osmosis, things like that. But I really want to just have more of an open discussion tonight and just kind of talk about it. And so when I looked at it, one of my first things when I said, okay, I agreed to do this, Tom kind of twisted my arm. And so I kind of looked at it and I said, I typed in the internet and said, when physics and politics collide. And actually came up with an article, which is interesting. It's probably a little bit more on the conservative side, but it's kind of, they brought up some very interesting points. I brought up, kind of printed out one if people are interested in reading. But, yeah, okay, yeah, it's a lot better. So, one of he opens up his article by talking about, there's some, kind of a lot of political pressure, a lot of push, but also kind of talks about what is the kind of underlying technologies that really need to start occurring and kind of come in, and what are some of the, whatever you look at, whether it's nuclear, solar, all that, you have to look at not just the output once it's built, but what are all the resources that go into it in developing that technology, and also what's the resources in what happens with an accident, what happens if, after disposal, and all of those type of things, and wanting to consider what's that whole life cycle costs and risks when you're taking a look at the thing. So it's kind of an interesting, one of the things that you could come out when you're searching the internet on the subject, you can find, very pro points, very con points, and it becomes very much a pretty good debate, onto it. And where are some of the realities? And so one of the things I want to do today is, as we're going along here, just jump in, ask questions, make some points, items like that. Because again, I just really kind of wanting to take this more of a facilitation discussion than trying to drive home a certain opinion or point type of thing. And so one of the things I want to do is talk a little bit about the general structure of the delivery market, talk a little bit about what are some of the legislative activities some of the supply options, the disadvantages and advantages onto it. Then I got a lot of charts on what's happening on overall global emissions, what's happening in the US, what's happening in China, what's happening in India, what's happening worldwide, and how are we comparing of our efforts onto that. And then just some general discussion, will this new Green Deal work? And one of the things I asked myself, how do I make a conclusion here? So I asked ChatGPT, and I asked saying, will the Green Deal work? And it gave me an answer. And I said, then another question I asked, why it won't work. So I kind of present, at the end on both sides, of it, onto it. So just really want to kind of have it more kind of an open discussion. Does that make any sense, or? Okay.
A lot of electricity to run the chat.
But
Running the chat GPT.
yeah, exactly, yes, yeah. So, in terms of the basics, when you look at it, we have, the generation. We typically, historically, we've had a lot of centralized plants. You have transmission that brings it in to substations, steps down the voltage, and distributes around the community, and then the distribution system bringing into the homes and all that. Now, it's a little bit of sense of irony. I was supposed to give this talk at the end of March last year, and I think the lights went off. Yeah. So
You got it.
and I was sitting there and I was looking at the weather. I live in southern Wisconsin, and so I was looking at the weather, and I think, so I started, saying, hey, there's some ice storms up in here. So I started making some calling around and things like this. Is this really going to happen? Is it going to, things like that. So it ended up getting canceled. So a little bit of irony on that one. And that one is, I've never seen all these years, that type of massive outage on that. And what kind of shows, especially with the overhead lines. And there was kind of this, for lack of better words, this perfect storm. You wouldn't have called it perfect when your lights are off here, but with that amount of icing you got, you had the trees going down, power poles going down, lines going down. So you lost the main transmission, backup transmission. You lost distribution in each of the towns, and it was a mess, onto it.
Quick question. From the generation to the substation to the distribution, what percent is lost?
What would you say? On the line losses.
What's the line transmission?
Energy losses in the trans. I think overall it's probably on average less than 5% energy losses from generation to the end up distribution onto it. Some of it is now in Jamaica, that loss is probably about 45% onto it, and that's mainly due to theft onto it. And one of the things, I'm actually half Swede and half Norwegian. And so I actually I'm a product of two mixed marriages. Because on my father's side, my grandfather was a Swede, and he married a Norwegian. On my mother's side, my grandfather was Norwegian, and he married a Swede. So I decided to keep that tradition up, and I got into a mixed marriage. I married a Jamaican. So we do, again, they're still a family house, and I'm just amazed at the amount of seeing all our cousins and everything of people that will work for Jamaican Power, and they make side money by bypassing and theft of service onto it. So it's a different culture down there. So, but anyway, I kind of digress after.
Don't I recall that at a transmission voltage, the super high voltage, that losses are less than at a lower distribution.
Yeah.
voltage.
Right. Yep.
So the longer the transmission line, or the more you can use the super high voltage of transmission, the better off you are as far as losses, I recall.
Yeah. And then over time, one of the things that we had is, when we first started, in the 20s, kind of the power industry just kind of growing, we had a lot of small plants. And then as we started kind of interconnections we ended up getting these massive centralized coal plants, nuclear plants, and all that. And now we've been going past 20 years going to smaller gas plants and kind of going back. So we kind of cycle back and forth on how this was all structured. And then originally, when this was all put together, nothing was really interconnected at all. And now you have kind of like four grids, main grids. You have the Quebec, the Eastern, Western, and Texas grids. And you have all of those are interconnected, and they're controlled by RTUs or regional transmission organizations that go in and schedule and wheel the power from one system to another, and all of that. And I got some diagrams on that too. So, and then when you look at what are the types of structure in the industry, you have the rural electric cooperatives. That'd be the distribution cooperatives like Thumb Electric, Presque Isle onto it. And they have, they own the distribution substations, the distribution lines, and then distribute it to their end consumers. They typically they've pulled together and they're part of, their owners of what they call a generation and transmission cooperative. And they build their generation and supply the distribution cooperatives with that. Then you have, and that oversight is really some co-ops, when you get large enough, some of them may be regulated by the Public Utility Commission. Most of them are unregulated because they look at it and say, your members are your owners, your end consumers are the owner of the cooperative, and they're part of the board, and you're actually a self-managed organization.
Who actually owns power grids, the actual transmission lines?
It's a mixture of different owners. There's some transmission owners, some of the IOUs, and it's a variety of different owners of it.
So many.
Yeah, many owners, yep, onto it. And then you have, like here in Charlevoix, you have the city is the electric provider. They buy their power from MPPA, Michigan Public Power Association, and onto that. And they're governed by the city. Here's the city council is the one that regulates that. And some other munis, you have a separate utility board that will manage and run that as well. And then you have your IOUs, like I'll age myself, I keep on calling them Detroit Edison. I don't know if they still go by that name anymore, but they're regulated. They're a publicly traded company, and they're regulated by the Public Utility Commissions of each of the states onto it, and looking at for setting rates and all of that type of thing. And then you have a lot of federal generation, federal power programs, kind of like TVA, Bonneville Power, things like that. And they'll, some of the time, like the TVA, it's federally owned, and they provide very heavy on hydro, some coal, a lot of nuclear, kind of a mix of different generation assets. And then more recently, we've seen a lot of independent power producers where somebody can build a gas turbine and then sell energy on the market under certain conditions and things like that. So one of the things when you look at one of the challenges with electricity is kind of just some general characteristics. One of the things, if you power generated from a nuclear plant, a coal plant, or hydro plant, it all follows the same specs, and so it all looks the same. So you can't really distinguish, oh, this was generated from coal or this was generated from nuclear. The other thing is it needs to be produced and consumed at the same time. Now you have some storage, and that's one of the big challenges right now that we, when you look at technology challenges and things like this, if we're going to really make renewables work, batteries are going to help, but we need a lot more innovation, a lot more. There's some alternatives that we really need to see move forward to address the storage issue. Because one of the things like in batteries and say, boy, we should have had a big battery here in Charlevoix and on the end of March and power the 4 days, 5 days that you're out of power. If you were to put a battery in enough to supply Charlevoix's load, it would cost for a battery to support a load for about 24 hours. It'd be at least $45 million investment on that. And so if you looked at something I want a week, it's the cost is how to address that. And so the storage is a real issue type of thing. And so then the other, the other piece that you have is kind of given, since it's being consumed and delivered at the same time, you really have to match your supply, the generation, the supply, whether the supply is through generation or batteries or some other storage source, it always has to equal demand. And if there's not enough demand, you have to shed load. And the utilities have multiple ways that they do that already today. One of them is through price incentives, where they have time of use pricing, different rates, the loads that you can shut off. What's real popular in farming areas is that you have an irrigation load price where, times where energy is abundant, you charge a couple cents a kilowatt hour. But if they pump, irrigate during high peak demand usage, they might be paying $3, $4, or $5 a kilowatt hour. So you're penalizing with the pricing. The other is, you have some load cycling of ACs, different type of loads where you can sign up where they can cycle when there's a high peak area. And what we're seeing more and more of, as we get heavier in some of the renewables, we're seeing more and more brownouts. And a brownout simply is, when you hear that term, is the power company is going through and looking at certain sections of the town and saying, I'm shutting you down circuit by circuit by circuit by circuit, and taking you offline for periods of time so they don't have demand exceeding supply, on that.
Quick question on your 45 million for the battery backup.
Yep.
Does that include like the newer Tesla mega packs or whatever they have for municipalities, or is that more of a traditional?
That's more of some of the estimates that I did some looking at, the saying kind of what it would take, for that. And that's using, and I know the Tesla, I can't recall what that was, but I think there's a scalability that you keep on running into, onto that. And I think it's one that, and there's been a lot of efforts on, I've seen people look at in high periods of time where they'll pump up to water towers, build it up, and then use a low head hydro, things like this. And I think there's things that we're gonna come up with some answers on that storage, but there's still some innovation that's really needed.
There's one of those in Ludington, right?
What's that?
You do that in Ludington? I think you do that in Ludington.
Yes.
Okay.
The storage facility is,
Doing it for much longer than the TVA.
Yeah.
Ran into a guy that oversaw the same system, but it was not new.
Yeah, it's been done for,
But
long
once
time.
you do it, once you build that system, it's not terribly high maintenance.
Yeah, so that's,
It's using gravity as a battery.
yeah, exactly. Yep. Like that. And so there's a lot of different, things that are working on. So it's kind of bad. I don't think lithium batteries is the long-term answer, onto that.
Yeah. It's sort of kind of funny because I think, back in January, there was this huge one up in Monterey County, the Cloud Fire, but nobody knew about it because there was fires in LA, but
Yep.
burned and burned and burned and burned. You know how often that happens?
Periodically, a friend of mine he has a salvage yard, and he had a damaged Tesla that they brought in and parked in the garage overnight, and he lost about half of his buildings onto it once it caught fire. And the lithium, when it goes on fire, it's nasty. It's hard to put out. And it's, and that's a reason why, the airlines, when they look at, they got restrictions on lithium batteries, on carrying them and things like that. It's, there's no real good answer to all of this, but I think there's a lot of questions, and that's where it kind of gets, kind of interesting.
Tom and I were at a conference last week where one of the presenters was an expert in firefighting and showing the multiple different ways to fight fires on lithium battery facilities, depending upon which manufacturer, and it was mind-blowing, the various things that they had to try and learn, because if you do the wrong thing on this one, it's going to explode, and on that one, it might be just the perfect thing to do.
So
Pretty scary sounding.
Yeah, so you're talking about there's a difference of like a Tesla battery and a Nissan battery. Yeah, and how it's, I hadn't heard that before.
It's the Wild West.
Yeah. like that. So, and the other kind of just some other terms, it's kind of load, it's, how much of the load, how much energy you need to supply all the devices and units that are turned on at any time. And one of the things we end up talking about base load and peak loading, when we get into that. And that's simply, when you look at the base load is kind of what's that minimum load? You have kind of what's that minimum that you have to supply just to keep your basic services going? And then what's the variable load? And so what you need to do is kind of given the characteristics, and again, through supply, either some storage or generation, you have to also be able to turn that peak load on and off onto it and meet that supply. And then the base load is not always constant either, because that base load will vary on temperature, time of day, a variety, and that kind of showing some crude curves, onto that. And that's one of the problems, like with renewables, you have to look and saying, I can't always know when they're going to be available. When is the wind going to blow? When is the sun going to come out? All of those type of things. Where if you look at some of the other like gas and some of the things, you can turn those on and off quicker. You got some large like coal and nuclear, they're hard to scale up or down, on output. So you have to kind of what's some of the characteristics of some of the plants to match the characteristics of the load they have onto it. Now, one of the things, I do have, and some of these graphs kind of show some variability of solar. And it was back about, I think about 9 years ago, 9 years ago, I put 8 kW of solar in my house. And just as kind of more of, I like to play with things, so onto it. So, but you'll take a look at saying, just kind of looking at what's the variability. And so right on the graph on the left is kind of saying, I'm trying to see what's, I gotta remember which is which here. Is that the day? That would be the, I'm trying to see.
Left is month.
Oh, yeah, the left is month, yes. Yeah, that's where it was. So this is kind of like, took a snapshot last week or onto it. So the far on the left is that's what the production was each day. And then if I take on the one on the right, it kind of shows the production month by month so far this year. And then the far upper right-hand corner kind of shows the last 5 years, showing month by month generation. And you just see the variability that you can see with that. And that's one of the, again, the challenges of saying, how do you match that to the load and what it does? And then if I take a look from a day-by-day basis, the last couple of ones are, were last week, and just seeing the difference, on the time of the day, the peak, where it's not generating. Then on the far right is the day last, I think it's in June, onto that. And just see that even in the summer, it looks like some clouds came over that day and just kind of cut it off and then jumps back up and onto that. And then what's really interesting, what was that? The solar eclipse was that a couple years ago already? And looking at some of the solar from some of our clients, and you go through that and just completely went up blank, like they turned the switch off type of thing.
Does it go down to zero when it rains or it's really cloudy, or is it just like 10% or?
Oh, yeah, it goes once you get, you get real cloudy or heavy rain, things like that, it drops down to zero.
Okay.
Yep, it'll cut off type of thing. So I take a look at it and say, okay, how much did I spend to put that up? And at that time, the cost was $23,000 to put it up. Now, the state of Wisconsin had cash rebates, and then you had the federal tax credit. So I ended up with about $12,000 in tax credits and direct rebates. So my net cost was $11,000. But at a net cost of $11,000, it still had an 8 to 9 year simple payback, not considering, what if I took that $11,000 and put in some investment at 3%, Yeah.
As you compared it to the cost of solar now, I've heard the price plummeted.
Well, the solar, some of the panels have decreased, things like that, but there's some pressure on the minerals, so they haven't dropped as fast as a lot of people have predicted. They're still, the costs they haven't installed, there's just still a fair amount of labor onto it, and then your inverters, things like that. So there's a little bit of cost, but then there's also, like the state of Wisconsin, that's pretty well removed, that, the amount of the rebate that they had, type of thing. So,
But all the control devices, the inverters and so on, have all dropped in price and will become much more reliable, which is the case with most electronics.
yeah, the case of electronics, but I've had some neighbors that have kind of taken a look at it, and they've done, when they look at the economics, they haven't decided to do it. There's been costs and drops, but it's still a very long payback, and it's still pretty well dependent upon, either you have to have a curiosity or desire to throw it up onto it, and so it's not an economic payback that you're gonna see with it.
I don't think the Midwest is,
Yeah,
specifically Michigan, is
yeah,
a great place to try this.
Yeah.
Arizona, I don't think you'd get those results.
right, yeah, it's very location. This is in southern Wisconsin, just south of Madison, so a little bit more sunny than it is here on the west coast of Michigan, but not that much.
That's sunny.
Yes.
What about transmission costs, building, there's a lot of desert, Arizona. What about building a lot of that desert space and transmitting?
Yep.
Is there any feasibility in that?
There's been a bunch of those that have been tried so far. It has not had the greatest results from a
What
financial
was
aspect.
the failure
On the financial cost of it.
and what produced the financial costs?
What do you mean, what produced it?
Well,
What-
if I want to make a profit of 50%, it's not feasible.
Yeah, well, you have to take a look at it and saying from when the investor-owned utilities and the power producers and all of these, so they take a look at it and say, I need to build a generation I'm going to supply. They're going to be looking at what's going to be giving them that rate of return, which really drives, our economy onto it. But, for some of these renewables, in order to make them feasible from a financial aspect, from a rate of return aspect, of which, the regulated utilities and all that are following, it needs some type of subsidization to keep those alive. And that's one of the challenges here onto it of, and it's such a core part of our economy of the energy costs of what it's going to, it's a very complex discussion, and that's why we need some discussions about it, of what it is. Are we going to be willing to pay a higher price for energy or lower, or what is the ultimate goals here?
You'll get a return on your transmission line investment. The question is how much and over how much time.
Yeah.
And part of that, no one can answer because it hasn't been done.
Yeah. And then the other problem with like solar and some of these, you'll start seeing, I forget the percentage, but it does degrade each year. And you'll have a specific lifetime on these panels.
So it
And then-
depreciates.
Yeah, you have to have onto it. And then we had last fall, we didn't have the ice storms that we had, but we did have last April, about a little over golf ball size hail at home. The solar panels survived it, my roof didn't. So I had to put a new replacement in the roof. But I had to pay to have the solar panels removed to get a new roof put on and then reinstalled. That cost us $4,500. That was just the labor onto it. So it is, that insurance pays for it, so I didn't include that. But if I had to replace that roof, onto what is the?
How much degradation are you getting off your panels? I mean, like 1, 2, 3% a year less.
I haven't looked at what the percentage is, onto it. It's been a while since I've looked at what that expected is, but it is I think it's under 1% a year, a couple percent a year type in that. So they estimate that they have about a 20, 25-year life expectancy. And what I'm expecting, if it's going to be that short, I'm going to start seeing some drastic drops pretty soon, because these are about 9 years old now, type of thing.
Since you mentioned Arizona, I have a winter home in Arizona, and only had it for a couple of years, but I was amazed at how little solar is used on a personal basis out there.
Yeah.
And the main issue is not just the high cost, which you mentioned, installation and things. It's that retail reimbursement is not anywhere close to what when it started 5 years ago or 10 years ago when I first started doing it. Everybody that puts it in says by the time I get it in, they cut the utility cuts in half what they reimburse you to put back in the grid if you have a little extra, or what they take off your bill and all that.
Yep.
They're just not promoting it anymore. They were doing it when it was a little bit like this, but once the solar installations started going in, all they did was cut the cost, and now it's not. It's not feasible.
Yeah, and that's a good point. When you take a look at it, and that's where I kind of alluded in that last sentence, when you take a look, if I'm looking at this as a generation source to generate things, the cost I'd want to compare it to, what's the other cost of the marginal cost to produce with the other alternatives. And the solar still tends to be fairly high on the kilowatt hour price of producing that price, which is one of the challenges there. Now, when you look at in Wisconsin, I'm still, I'm served by Alliant Energy, which is an IOU, and the Wisconsin PUC requires the IOU to buy back at, I think it's like 80% of the retail onto it, which is pretty high, onto it. Normally, if you like in a co-op or a municipal, things like that, they're going to pick some marginal cost of production and they may be selling it for you. And also I get a pretty high kilowatt hour rate, where they sell it's almost 16 cents a kilowatt hour there. But most places would be buying that back from you maybe for 3 or 4 cents onto it, because that's really what that production costs. And one of the things that's really kind of out of whack when you look at pricing rate structures in the US, you look at what's the cost to hook up to the grid, what's the cost to support all that distribution system, the wiring, the substations, and all that infrastructure and control. Right now we have typically a fixed fee on your electric bill, and then you have an energy charge. You could make a pretty good argument saying our fixed fees are way too low. And that cost, that energy charge of 16 cents per kilowatt hour probably is more like a nickel. And the rest really should be on a fixed charge type of thing. And so in one case, I could look at it and say, yeah, I have this. I happen to have one of the things that I'm not really dependent upon my payback price or my buyback price on the benefits, because I do have a pool, and then I run a pool pump during the summer. And so I'm running the pool pump at the time that I'm producing the most. And then I run that through kind of a geek. So I have some water heaters that are just, black tubes, and you pump the water, pool water through the black tubes and then put it in the pool.
So you're using electricity.
Yeah, so I'm generating this electricity. My primary usage is a pool pump, which then pumps it through another, kind of a water solar. And my temperature in the pool is generally about 90 degrees without any external heater. And so I'm doing that. So there's energy to be gained, onto all that, but I'm not dependent upon that buyback price to make this work onto it on that one. So then a little bit about the history. Of course, when we started, it was kind of the Wild West, where everybody had their little towns, and you see a lot of the small communities and the small company. You always see maybe a little hydro plant and coal plant, onto that. And they were pretty well not interconnected. And then they started pulling together, it started in the late 30s and 40s, kind of starting interconnections and all that. And then in the early 90s, kind of opened up the network and transmission network up even more, and kind of started more and more interconnections, energy trading, and back and forth. And then a big issue in 1996, we had 2 FERC orders, and it was opening up kind of the structure of the industry, basically saying you can separate generation, transmission, the distribution. Yeah, I think in California, you had Enron that was out pushing and saying, okay, you can completely separate and just buy your energy from separate company, and then you pay fees for all the other pieces. It never, there's pieces of that have kind of evolved. And of course, everybody saw what happened to Enron, but they were a little bit over optimistic, and there was some other things that happened on that one. But then in the 2005, we started getting more incentives for production and trying to encourage some different investments, things like that. So it's been kind of slow evolving legislation, but it's continuing to do. And one of the things you get is in the interconnection, you basically have, this control where you have the east and the west are the two biggest interconnection, little spot in Alaska, Texas, and then Quebec onto that. And these are all kind of tied together onto it. So they look at, their own separate planning, making sure they kind of the interconnection, the distribution of.
Really simple question.
Yep.
Texas basically shut down.
Yep.
Why didn't they just flip some switches?
Because you look at what's the capacity, what's the transmission capacity that was coming into Texas.
So this only shows how they're connected, but not whether they're practically connected.
Well, then there are multiple things that happen in Texas, onto that. One is they were very heavy on renewables onto it. They didn't go into, there's another group called these regional transmission organizations that schedule the buying, selling, and delivery, and how you're scheduling, all of that. They had the ice storms that came through. They lost, just like you guys, not as bad as you guys did, but they lost a lot of the distribution. They lost a lot of the ability for the wind and some of the solar and some of the generation, even some of the gas, some of that. They lost a lot of their generation that's available in that area. They hadn't pre-scheduled enough transmission capacity to come into Texas at the same time. So, yeah, there's markets that are buying.
So who has that crystal ball?
Yeah, that is a very good question, which kind of leads into.
Wasn't there windmills like not winter?
Yeah, there's turbines that iced up. There's lines that iced up. It was just kind of one step after another that kind of did that. And then what you do is you have NERC that really kind of oversees a lot of this pieces. And then you have and I really don't know how this works. And this is kind of some of the black magic stuff that goes, maybe Tom has some insights on a little bit of this. And these are the guys, they're nonprofit organizations, and these are the ones that are out there doing the scheduling, and they're looking ahead and saying, what's the price of transmission? What's the price of generation going to be next week, next month? What's it today? What's the market pricing? And there's times like in the Midwest, we got a lot of, especially in Iowa, southern Minnesota, there's heavy wind turbines, a lot of wind power. There's times in heavy wind areas that they're paying you to take the power. You have negative energy costs. Then there's other times where that energy, and one of the things that killed Texas is that spot market energy price as they were losing it down, the demand for that supply started increasing. So your spot market pricing just skyrocketed. And so, and a lot of people, one of the things in Texas, they had done the separation where in Texas, you can sign up for an independent power producer to actually deliver the power to your home. But in the fine print, they give you a nice kilowatt hour rate when everything is working right. But in the fine print, they said, under certain conditions, you're going to pay spot market pricing. And all of a sudden you had these businesses that would have, $1,500 a month bill, usually all of a sudden seeing a $30,000, $40,000, $50,000 bill that they had to cover.
Is it one of the great ways in the stock market to lose money, to buy short and buy long?
Yep.
Yep.
I don't know.
That's what that sounds like.
Yeah. I don't know if they buy, I think there's some buying short and long on that. I think.
There's some of that. There are companies that retail extra power, peaking power for utilities, but I managed the utility in Lowell and then Harbor Springs after that. And we would buy a base load at a certain price, a low price, and that means this is the lowest we expect our energy demand to be. So I'm going to buy all of that, And then I will pay, a higher price for the energy above that that's likely to happen, but, somewhat predictable. But then I'll make a deal for when the shit hits the fan and there's a whole lot of air conditioners all running on August 13th and stuff, then I'm paying through the nose for that extra power to keep everybody's stuff running. So you're kind of, like if you could do a wholesale deal with the eggs at the grocery store, I'm gonna need 2 dozen every day, but when people come, I'm gonna need 4 dozen, and they're gonna charge you more because they had to stock that for you. So it's a very complex thing, and
that's what,
most of this would be done within what they call the MISO, the orange section there, where we would have connections with different utilities and basically buy wholesale what you think you're gonna need, and then have a contract for what additional, when you need it, what you're gonna pay.
and then you had with Harbor Springs and Lowell, you were part of MPPA, which is I always forget that acronym, the
Michigan Public Power Association, they call it a joint action agency. And that's so small cities like we were could be a part of an investment in a big power plant. No way could we afford a power plant big enough for our city, but we could invest a small share in the Campbell plant down in Saugatuck or in Holland, and together we could buy into a turbine generator down in Kalkaska, and each of us buy a share and operate it jointly, and that's how that works.
So everything is clear as a bell now so far?
So really, you're treating it like a stock market, where you can buy on margin, you can buy short, you can buy long. You're really guessing based on past.
Yeah. And you have to guess accurately, because.
Well, that's how some people become very adept with this.
Yes.
I forget the guy's name, he was Fidelity, and he didn't lose. But that's exactly what he was doing.
No.
Anybody who's talking anything about the stock market says, don't do that. Except if you could be like Peter, whatever, Lynch or something like that.
Yeah, so it's a.
Well, but you can't bet on that one.
No.
That California did in the early 2000s, and they had, just a nightmare of electric costs because they were playing games with it. Instead of just buying what they needed, they were buying and selling and making profits, and suddenly, a utility would have to pay 4 times what they did last year at this time.
Yeah, all that, so. Okay, so then we get into legislation, we get onto that. And I think, one of the big things is kind of going from the Farm Bill to the Inflation Reduction Act to the renewable energy, and then the EPA's push on kind of, let's say, all electric vehicles. So at the same time, you got the push for renewables, you got the push to say, all the electric utilities, and if everybody does, we start meeting these EV objectives, what's going to happen to the load? What's going to happen to, if you got a transmission line, it's only capable of, so much capacity, what's going to happen, what upgrades are needed to do with the transmission, the distribution systems and all that. If we meet all these objectives going to EVs, what's going to happen to the load and the base load and the variable load, onto that. So these are all kind of things that are happening. And then you have a lot of activities beyond this in the states. And if I looked at it, I didn't look up all the bills here, but I kind of typed in, what are the energy related bills in Michigan? And they have the last 3 years. So you have, 110, 115 bills. And these things range from, requirements of, going EVs for certain entities. You had things where I think there was some legislation on limiting wind turbines on Lake Michigan. You had legislation talking about you can't use farmland for solar. There was a lot of things. And there was also a lot of legislation talking about a lot of municipals like Holland and Marquette, they have their own natural gas generation. And there's some legislation where they're going to be potentially forced to shut those down onto it. And it's a very low cost, a very, from an emissions, yeah, there's CO2 emissions, but it's a relatively clean when you look at a lot of the other alternatives. And the legislation may be trying to shut them down, which is going to all of a sudden, like Marquette and Holland being in a situation where they're generation rich, where they can sell out in the market. So all of a sudden now, if they have to sell and drop that, they have to mothball the investment that they have in the plants, and then turn around and now have to go into the market game buying onto it. So it's,
What's the politics of that?
well, and that's the one. That's why I started thinking when physics and politics collide. Let's kind of get some common sense, to some of these discussions, onto it, because on something like that, they're already, and then there was even a crazier one like in Seattle. Seattle is a public power utility, and they're primarily served on a Bonneville Power, all hydro, and they have to meet a certain number of reduction of, so many kilowatt hours of reduction of fossil fuels, and they're sitting there and saying, well, we really don't have it. How would I meet this regulation? And they can't, and they're faced with potential fines, not being able to meet these reduction goals based on their consumption. So there is a lot of nonsense in some of this legislation that comes out without really thinking about what is it that we're really trying to do.
Trying to simplify it, but one that happened around 2008 and 9 was the transmission organization that serves the utilities in Michigan was obligated by law to build up the transmission system so that renewable power from windmills in Iowa and stuff like that could be used more in the state of Michigan. But we had to have better highways for that electricity to come. So all of the utilities are paying a very high price to build up that transmission system. On the other hand, you had the state of Michigan saying that all your utilities must meet a locally Michigan-generated renewable power standard. So we're building the highways for the cars to come from, for the power to come from Iowa, but we're saying that you need to build, you need to generate that in Michigan instead. So we built the highway and then we didn't use it. Yeah.
So that's that. So, and I think one of the things that we're doing is that we're kind of more of evolving what we call kind of this smart grid concept, where you have a lot of distributed generation, smaller generation, rooftop solar, wind farms, all of that. And so we're kind of looking at, you have to have things more interconnected, more communication between the different devices, and more coordination onto it. And that's where I more work into is how do you communicate from one location to another, and kind of the, what are the software and systems and like that needed to do. So I could go in and talk about hours on that stuff here. So, but if I really want to bore you on that, that would on that. So then they get into kind of what are some of the different generation sources, today. And of course, coal is probably one of the still largest ones, especially worldwide. It's really one of the largest sources of energy today. It's really been the backbone. It's been relatively cheap, but you have the mining costs, all that, the environmental costs, the pollution, on that. So here in the U.S., we don't really see new coal coming up. We really see a lot of the existing coal plants being shut down and mothballed and being obsoleted. Most of our growth in supply in the U.S. has been under natural gas. It's pretty abundant. It's low cost. It's a lot less burning. I think I forget the number, but it's it's about half of what the CO2 emission equivalent coal would be onto it, and it has great peaking. You can turn it on and off. You can cycle it on and off quick and all that, and has a lot of great characteristics.
No one ever talks about one of the main byproducts of natural gas, which is the fracking.
Yeah, and any of
Soup,
these,
soup of chemicals. What do they do with it?
yeah, and that's any of these things. You all have to look at what's the one characteristic
Overall.
and then what's the overall type of thing on every one of these, because there is nothing that is perfect. There's nothing that is without issues. There's nothing, and you have to make trade-offs onto it.
Worldwide coal usage is like that all-time high right now, isn't it?
What's that?
Worldwide coal usage is like.
Yes, and it's spiking and it's increasing mainly from the outputs China and India. And I got some kind of overall graphs a little bit here, but that's kind of, and our CO2 emissions in the U.S. has been declining. It's on the decline and like that, but India and China are almost exponential on their increasing onto it. And then the other source, you have oil, diesel generation, things like that. You still have a lot of that in the U.S., but it's for peaking plants. And I would imagine the hospital in town went down. The hospital is starting up their diesel generators to keep the lights on during that time frame. So it's still a good peaking source that you can kind of have a reserve. You can turn it on quickly, and you can do that. So but it's not a base load at all. It's really just used on peaking, and a lot of peaking and emergency times for critical loads type of thing. And of course, nuclear power onto that. A lot of people will talk about nuclear power as being renewable. Others will talk about it shouldn't be an alternative. And there's a lot of heavy debates on should we be doing nuclear, non-nuclear, items like that, but it is still a pretty large percentage of the whole generation package in the U.S. and worldwide. In some countries, it's primarily like France, it's pretty much all nuclear generation, onto it. So it is something that's here onto it. And then, of course, the different accidents, things like that, the near accidents. Some of the cases that, some of the things when you hear about the different things that happened onto it, especially Chernobyl, if you look at when they were going through that disaster, because the operators, if they took a manual out and said, the worst thing you can do is X, that's what they did every step of the way, onto it. And they had some poor designs, things like that. And then there were some edgy people, and the tsunami in Japan, I'm looking at what would happen structurally on that one, things like that. So there is always that, what's the risk there onto it. So you have to, and then you have to look at, what are the spent fuel rods, type of thing. What's the thing? So it's a very, when it's working well, low cost, clean, works great. But then you have to, any of these, you have to look at what's the balance of the risk rewards, things like that.
Is there any latest on nuclear fusion, or is it still 30 years away?
I can read fine articles that say, hey, it's going to be tomorrow, and others that it'll never happen. You have a lot of push on, one of the things that we're saying a lot across one of the big loads in the U.S. is data centers. And those things are, a constant base load, that, you turn those on and you have to supply it. And you have, Microsoft, and I think Amazon is really looking at it. They're looking at nuclear, putting in their own nuclear facilities to power the warehouse, the data centers, onto it. So that, I think that's where you're going to see some of the push. And I know there's a lot of people that have been working on it. I got an old friend of mine, Paul Hunt. He came up with it. You got the utility industry. If anybody remember Hunt Technologies, the turtle system where they communicated, got meter information from your meter using the power line as the communication media onto it, and he sold that for about $30 million back 20 years ago. And he tinkering, building zero consumption energy housing and small scale reactors. It's kind of what he's been playing with. So he got a lot of innovation going on to it, but is it 5 years out or is it never? I don't know. And if I knew, I probably would be playing the stock market onto it. And the other, you got the solar, wind, and hydro, and solar, and of course, one of the big challenges with, especially solar and wind is the variability. When is it going to be available? How can I predict when it's going to be available? And this, you really need to make solar and wind more viable. You need a better energy source, on a large scale energy source, to really make that work better. And it's also still fairly expensive, and you still have some different lifetimes. And you, of course, also have what are some of the disposal costs, the manufacturing, the mineral usage, of those two as well. So there's nothing, and one of the things this article here they talk about is saying we can talk about, solar and wind being carbon free, but you have to really look at what's the total footprint, what it's used to produce, what's the used to run. You have to look at the whole cycle of everything, just like in nuclear, just like in coal, just like in all the other sources. Everybody, they all have their bad points. Now, hydropower is one, especially when you're natural, we were talking earlier about Norway, where they just have an abundance of hydropower there onto it, and basically free electricity. Canada, the same thing. I used to live up in Winnipeg. Fargo wasn't cold enough, so I moved 200 miles north to Winnipeg. And that one is that it's all hydropower on that. And they actually have free, it's cold enough. You guys up here will know about having to plug in your cars to keep them warm to get started. In Winnipeg, they have every parking lot in every thing has an outlet that you plug in, because you literally, and you also had to keep a little hair dryer, and they called it a car warmer, and a battery blanket. Otherwise, the cars would never start up there, because you'd have about a 3-month stretch where it would not get above zero. And frequently the highs for the day would be like -40, on that. So, but anyway, I kind of digressed there a little bit. And then you got biomass, which is kind of wood, grain type of things. I'm not quite sure if I really buy the argument on it. There's a lot of people who claim biomass is carbon neutral onto it, and they claim that because it's, uses carbon dioxide to grow, eventually it kind of recycles itself. And I think the big thing that you have with biomass is the pollution, that you get. And I remember in the 70s where there was a big push in the US of saying, you need to use wood to heat your home. And like in the state of Montana had it where they were giving residences free wood. And the problem is that you go in like Missoula and the different towns in the winter, and you have this yellow haze over each of the town because of burning wood. And so you have, and especially when if you're kind of burning like in coal, you have bakehouses and, I just kind of went blank on the name of the antenna, kind of taking it, so slurry, you spray a lime slurry in the exhaust, in the emissions, and it takes kind of the sulfur out onto it. But you have the, in a large scale, when you have ways to take some of the emissions out, but one individual burning and things like that, you're just putting everything up in the air onto it. So does that add a lot of clarity to what the right answer is? So, and the others that you have kind of coming in, kind of the nuclear fission, where is that going? Hydrogen is one that it really interests me to say, is that going to be something, is that a potential for battery storage and storage pieces? There's a couple of companies out east that are really looking at doing hydrogen-based batteries onto it. And there's some of the talks about, can you have hydrogen powered cars type of thing. But then you have hydrogen on, remember the Hindenburg type of thing. So, so you have, there's some of it's portable, but there are some other safety concerns. You have to look at it. And then you have, especially out in Massachusetts, out on the East Coast, there's a lot of talk about tidal power and generation. But these are all kind of kind of all kind of more on the emerging, if I could speak, emerging side of it, of things here. And then again, when you look at any of these, you have to come back to what are the characteristics? And what's really needed and kind of keeps on coming back is we really need something better than lithium batteries on their storage, onto it. And then these are just kind of some quick, kind of what are some of the advantages, disadvantages, hydro onto it, but you do have, it's an availability issue. Like you go up North Dakota, there's not a lot of opportunities for hydro. When you go to Norway, huge opportunities, for oil and natural gas, it can also, they're still available in large quantities, but you have the gas and the emission waste, and then a coal. We've got lots of resources, lots of coal availability, but then, the emissions, are kind of the issue, and it's low cost type of thing. So you go through and there's pretty, yep.
Is there a way to scrub the harmful pollutants that come out of a coal plant?
Yes, and that's the word I was going blank on. They call them scrubbers onto it. It helps greatly reduce it. And you look back at the coal emissions back in the 60s and the 70s, and I remember the first time going out east. I grew up in the Fargo, North Dakota area, and I remember going 11 years old, going through Cleveland, Ohio, and about my mouth, dropped on seeing you'd have these orange and yellow and just these clouds of smoke coming out of buildings, and just kind of, this is nuts, on that. But they have, basically scrubbers, and what you do with that emission, it's a lime slurry that you spray into it, and that will kind of reduce it. But then also then you have that's why a lot of the power plants, you'll see the big sludge storage areas, and that's the slurry that's left over from the scrubbers. And you have to have a clay liner because you don't want to get that stuff into the groundwater.
Is there a way to reduce it even further?
Yeah, there's different tech, and I haven't kept up with what those technologies are, onto it. But they're, when they talk about clean coal, coal today is a lot cleaner than what it was, 10 years ago, 20 years ago, but it's still a lot dirtier than some of the other alternatives. And then when you take a look and say, one of the questions, when you look at some of the production and worldwide, how much of those emission items are they really putting on? Is China really using scrubbers? Are they using bag houses just to filter out the particulate matter? What are they really, what are their standards that are going on to that?
One of the concerns for utilities that had coal is that as the restrictions increased, they would put more and more pollution fighting equipment on the coal plant to the point where pretty soon it was uneconomical compared to the options of natural gas and some of the other options. So you're investing more and more into basically just raising your price, until it doesn't make sense anymore.
So, then we get into, of course, nuclear. I think the big is the risk of accidents. What do you do with the waste? It's fairly high cost to build in the States, all of that. And then biomass, what is the, although it's considered renewable, it is another burning type of thing. And then solar and wind is really more, it can be when it's running, it's clean, but intermittent. And then what's the cost of bringing it and distributing it?
I have a quick question, like, people put up solar panels, nobody puts the windmill. So is it that, less efficient than solar, say, like that?
Well, I think the wind in this, it's just what you have to, to get that turbine moving. I've seen a lot of work on, there's little things you can see that you kind of have almost look like the spinning the opposite direction type of thing. I just don't think it generates enough onto it without having kind of that large blade, onto it. But again, I haven't looked at that question in particular. That's just my guess of what that answer might be.
The cost of solar has beaten out wind to where that's the direction more people are going because it's much more economical, especially with solar cells from China.
The current reduction of the government sponsored solar and wind, is that impacting the development, that direction? Or is that just?
Well, I think you're seeing a lot of growth in solar and wind onto it, but the biggest growth of production in the US has been gas turbines onto it. And that's really driven a kind of a cost balance. And then when you get heavy areas of heavy renewables, it's harder to maintain the reliability of the grid because of the intermittence of it with the lack of storage. You know, and that's another problem that Texas had. They were very heavily dependent upon renewables, and then they started losing a lot of all that as well. So they didn't have that extra capacity available under normal circumstances. I don't know if did that even come close to answering your question.
No.
Yeah. Yeah.
Someone only knows how to flip the switch.
Yeah. Yep.
So with wind, does it generate electricity directly? That's the first part of the question. And the second is, how is it transmitted? I mean, what are the mechanics for transmitting the energy to substation or?
Okay, so with the wind, your question is, when is it generating? Was that the first?
So what's happening at the tower?
Oh, what's happening at the tower? Okay, you have the blades that are turning, and in that little hub, you have a turbine. You have a generator that's generating electricity from the rotation, you know, onto it. Then you have to have, that farm then will have a substation that connects to, and then you have to have a transmission line to wherever you're going to be trying to distribute that power to. So you have to interconnect into that transmission grid.
So other than big wind farms, are they underground?
You have some, it varies where it's at. You have some, transmission tends to be more overhead than underground because of the cost and some of the heat generated and all that. And so a lot of it is overhead lines on the transmission getting it out. Yep.
Yeah, so if you go down to mid-Michigan off of US 27, you'll see them, right? Do you have any idea, like, okay, I'm a farmer, they came and put this thing on my land, how much money am I making on that thing? I mean, is it fixed, or is it how, like, what it produces, or?
Yeah, I'm not sure on that one. A number of years ago, I know there was a lot of one-time fees that they would get from the farmers, but I'm not sure where they've gone on some of the contracts. And a lot of that is the Michigan stuff here owned by Duke. They own a lot of it.
There's some of that, but some through the Michigan Public Power Agency has some other providers. But my recollection was when we were looking at wind farms and so forth, I think those farmers or whoever owns the property there is probably making, between $1,000 and a few $1,000s a month for
each tower or for each
for
mill.
the land that they've leased for that.
Yeah.
So it's a moneymaker for them.
Yeah. And then one of the opponents of wind will talk a lot about the birds, the birds flying into the thing and what it does to the bird life, type of thing. So there's always type of thing.
It's true that skyscrapers kill a lot more birds.
Yeah, so, yeah.
Just ask Sullenberger about heat.
Sullenberger.
There's a guy landed the plane.
Oh, okay, yes. Or Dave Winfield in Toronto, is it the seagull or is that a pitcher did that? He was doing a picture and all of a sudden there was a gull that flew down
Oh, no.
and it exploded. Yeah, so.
Oh, no.
So now let's get into some a little bit more fun graphs here. And this one is, it just kind of just a series of graphs. I went on EIA and then a couple of other sources just to try to keep some consistency. One of the things I noticed when I was looking at some of this background is that depending on which report, how they report it can vary greatly, and you start kind of wondering, what's believable, what's not believable. And so this kind of gives an idea of, what we petroleum, renewables, nuclear, natural gas, and coal, what that's been doing here in the US. And so you can see coal on the bottom, has really since 2000 kind of peaking and really has drastically reduced in the US, where we're seeing natural gas, kind of that area kind of widening. Nuclear has declined slightly, but you've seen some pretty good steps on renewables, but not as much as you've seen on the natural gas increases.
Aren't the sources for the data listed?
Yeah, so this one is on that. But
Are they not to be trusted?
well, I think the EIA is probably pretty trustworthy, but I was trying to look at multiple sources, and then I started looking at how much time do I want to spend trying to track down each one of these. And so what I ended up doing, I got it coming up here in the next one. This is the EIA kind of showing what's the breakdown in the US.
Ask you a question. What does EIA stand for?
The Energy Information Administration onto that. It's a federal government agency onto it.
All the utilities are doing reports to the EIA
Oh,
on at least an annual basis.
And so from a trustworthy, these would generally should be accurate coming from the EIA. But there's other sources that probably aren't, question.
You can bias any source.
Yes, exactly, yeah, so.
Why nuclear's at, like, it seems like it's like the percent wise really hasn't changed in the last 20 years. And I think we've lost a lot of plants, haven't we?
I don't think we've lost a lot of plants. It's just more, there's not any new built and things, and the ones that have been mothballed, in the overall percentage. And you'd have to look at, the scale. It's a pretty wide scale here onto it. So you could.
It's starting to turn around.
Yep. And then, of course, onto this one. And then we look at by world. And this one, kind of a lot of this data is from our world data onto it. And it seemed to be pretty consistent like that. So I'm kind of doing some faith on the accuracy of this here. So, but you look at from, nation, kind of globally, we see coal increasing, gas increasing, nuclear kind of very similar to the US, not really expanding, kind of a little bit of a collapse. And so some nominal gains in hydro, and then wind and solar, onto it. But you see coal kind of moving up. Then you take a look at one of the things on the, this one is on the world, what is the CO2 emissions overall worldwide, of how that just kind of continues to go up onto that. And then you look at here in the United States, where our CO2 emissions, have been kind of, again, declining since 2000 type of thing, and kind of on a continued downturn. You always see, you can see COVID here and that little blip on each one of these graphs onto it. And then this is kind of, again, kind of showing where the emissions are coming from. And you can kind of see the European Union and Europe, excluding the European Union, the US kind of more of on a declining trend. The US a little bit constant, but then you see the big gains on emissions coming out of China and India, onto it.
This doesn't deal with the population of those areas.
Oh yeah, we showed the population here. There's some other graphs that will show the population. And one of the things I show, like in the US, on a per capita generation of CO2, we're one of the highest ones. And onto that, China and India are relatively low, but rising. And that's kind of, they have a lot larger population. So it depends on how you start taking a look at some of these things. And I think to your point, if I wanted to try to make an argument one way or another, you could probably extract and try to make different points out of this.
The number of users is.
Yeah.
Like to be.
Yeah. And then you take a look, the other thing with like China and India, they're doing more of the world's production of manufacturing and different things too. And so you're gonna get a natural increase. And so, but it kind of gets into one of the things, what's their choice of energy generation is one of the big questions, onto it, and how that could be influenced as well onto it. And so if I look at, and this again kind of shows the, kind of a little bit more of the emissions on how China has really spiked up, the US kind of down, and then, but we're still, higher than, the second highest. We're declining, but we're still high, that type of thing.
Is there any way to show who owns the carbon that's in the air already?
What's that?
How much carbon that's already in the atmosphere over the last 100 years?
Yeah, there are some graphs in this, on this thing, so if they probably have, when I started sorting through all the different things, there's probably about 800 different types of graphs and things like that you can pull out, and I'm sitting there, okay, this is for an hour and a half for a presentation, so what I just wanted to kind of show some of the, what is, different ways to look at this.
I hear the argument, well, China produces a lot more than we do, but yeah, but we can put a whole lot more up in the air than China has.
Yeah, historically, and that's one of the things, and I saw some graphs that will talk about the United Kingdom shouldn't be allowed to produce anything because before 1950, they produced all, basically onto it. And then when I counter and saying, well, okay, how much of historic emissions is it still hanging, or has it been consumed by plants? Because plants consume, they live off of carbon dioxide. And so you kind of get into what's the, and I'm not trying to get into those arguments on is CO2 really bad? And then, so it kind of gets into, that, there's debates going on that, onto that. And, one of the things where, that the plants consume carbon dioxide, type of things. So you have, what is that piece there? And then now this one I talked about, like on the per capita on the emissions. So you can take a look at, what's the United States and Canada is not even kind of a blip here, but you look at on a per capita basis, US and Canada are the bigger producers, are bigger emitters onto it. Where you see China and India still fairly low, but China is now catching up, being number 3 on the per capita, even with their massive population. So it's different ways to looking at that. And then here, and again, this is the emissions per capita, different ways. I think some of this is kind of repeat. And then what's the different sources of the CO2? And of course, electricity and heat worldwide are really the big causes onto that, and then transport. And then in the US, we're heavy on the transport. Electricity, again, has been declining, on all that as well. And then the gas emissions in China, so you can kind of slice these things up multiple ways. And I think the point gets into it is if you're talking about global emissions, we can have some impacts here in the US, but you have to have more of a global strategy to really address if you're looking at wanting to look at global CO2 emissions. You have to have a more coordinated effort from different countries. And do you do that lead by example, or is there, how do you regulate that? How do you push that? And that's a pay grade well above I to come up with that answer onto that. And so this kind of gives it kind of a little another, what's the annual emissions from coal today onto it? And you look at kind of China, India, in the US, we're still number 3 under that. But, onto that. And then you look at coal, fuel type of how it's been growing, and you take a look at the spike of coal oil, worldwide, of how that's been, all 3 of those are spiking up onto it. And then you look at it in the US, we've had a spike up with the gas. That's one of the biggest things that we have is to, replacing a lot of the coal fire with the gas, onto it. So you're seeing a flip, onto that one, which has a lot less emissions than the coal does. And then again here, you see China, India, it's just kind of spiking up. So in trying to come up with a conclusion, I went and said, like any geek, I asked GDP, and I said, what is, the new Green Deal? What is the pros and cons of it? And so this is what they kind of came out about. And what's interesting is kind of what, from the politician side point, we've kind of mixed climate change and economic inequality in the same discussions in the same legislature. And the solution to those things, is it really proper to try to mix those? To me, it doesn't. It seems illogical, onto it. I know that a lot of the some of the grants and things like that. We were helping some of our clients, look for the different grants under the Infrastructure Reduction Act and the others, and they were looking at trying to put EV chargers, but the bulk of the money for EV chargers and some of that were going into impoverished areas like downtown Detroit. And she'd start taking a look at it and saying, are people using EVs downtown Detroit? And is that going to help the cause of having more fueling stations along the interstates and more people can kind of get a better expansion, onto it? So I think a lot of the funding, is it really, by throwing a different twist into it, does it really change the outcomes and what you're really trying to do? So then I asked, will the new Green Deal work? And it responded, onto it saying, hey, it addresses the climate, at a scale, renewable energy, vital, growing, job creation. I think, and what I find interesting is that both sides, why it won't work and why it will, both talk about jobs. One says you're going to collapse jobs, and the other say you're going to grow jobs. So what is, so, and of course, ChatGPT is artificial intelligence. I think it's not natural intelligence that it has. It's going into searching all this databases of information, and it's basically kind of coming back to what the documents say. And so it's scary where it's going. But right now it's only as good as the information. And so you'll see on these things very conflicting statements, between the pros and the cons type of thing. But stimulate costs of inaction, the kind of climate disasters, how much that's going to cost, all of those type of aspects of it onto it. But it was very much I think a viewpoint of not looking at what the world is looking at too. And then when you look at, I asked the counter saying, why is it going to fail? And so it kind of came back, high costs, technical limitations, disruption to industries, lack of political support, too broad and unfocused, limited global impact, uncertain economic returns. And I think a lot what they say on the pros and a lot what they say on the cons is all true, but which ones, how we're going to actually address it and deal with it. So.
Isn't there some widget out there waiting? Do you know that? A leapfrog from where we are off.
I think that's what we're going to need, some type of thing, and I think it's in storage is going to be really what's going to turn the tide type of thing.
There's some things on geothermal where.
Yeah, and geothermal looks great in certain areas, but it's not a why. And I think the other thing is there's not going to be one generation technology that is going to work. It's going to take a group of different generation technologies.
I think
everybody wants
to have a mandate for this, mandate for that.
Yeah.
Electric cars works for certain people.
Yep.
I have one, fabulous.
Yep.
Doesn't work for other people.
Yep. And what's the most?
You have a mandate, it's gonna work for everything, and it's not.
Yep, exactly. What's the cheapest and most effective way of reducing your carbon footprint today? It's pretty simple.
You know?
Well, you could do that, but it's even simpler. What do you keep your temperature in your house at during the summer?
72.
72, 77. I got you beat. I keep mine at 78 on that. And then what do you heat your house to during the winter?
69.
Yeah, it's pretty warm.
Didn't you also look at the efficiency of the insulation in the house?
Oh, yeah, all that, like that. And actually, if you really want to do it, let's put a, you know, a wall, kind of, you know, large air barriers, things like that. But I think, but I said, what's the simplest way? Is turn your thermostat up during the summer and turn it down during the winter. And then you can add some insulation.
Simplest is only great as an end product.
Yeah.
Not in the process.
But one of the things, and I think we kind of, one of the things I always kind of see in these arguments, nobody is a too strong word. There's a large percentage of people want all this change, but they're not willing to change their comfort level. It's kind of the punchline I was getting to, because then when my wife comes to, you know, we kind of, you know, so we have a place in Wisconsin, and then she's a Delaware resident out of Wilmington, and she hates the cold. And so I literally keep my house at 62 during the winter, because coming from the Scandinavian heritage, there's a saying, there's no such thing as cold weather, just bad clothing onto it. And so, you know, and I keep my house at 62 until she comes home. Then I have to have it at 76 in the house. And then during the summer, she loves it at 78. But she's listed where she grew up. It's pretty constant. It's always 85, 86 degrees summer and winter. So, but anyway, so I kind of digress there a little bit on that. So my question is kind of posing, you know, when I look at this legislation and going through this, and after going through putting this presentation, the question that came up to me, when I look at the federal policies, is our goal really to promote renewables, or is our goal really to reduce carbon emissions? And to me, it almost seemed like a lot of legislation is kind of focused on, we're really centered on, let's promote renewables, and they kind of ask, who's making the money? I don't, you know, usually the answer is you follow the money and you're going to find an answer onto it. Because when I have to look at it and say, if I'm really looking at global CO2 emissions, I'd be pushing China and India as hard as I can to have gas generation and some other generation other than coal. Look at some other sources. But I'm not sure if we're really, what is our really clear policy? What are we really trying to accomplish? And so, and then from that, there's kind of what is any.
I do think the issue with the chat on the first one where it said environmental damages could be in the billions. I think that is way underestimated.
Yeah. And so, but that's on a global scale, you know, onto it. And, you know, what we're kind of chipping away and not really addressing, you know, things like that. And the argument is, and which, you know, is climate change a natural thing? Is it really influenced by CO2? You know, all that. And there's, you know, positions on both sides, you know, onto that. But my thought was, it would be easier to build a Viking ship and sail it to Norway than answering the question. So, yeah, which I've done before. So,
my question is, how much energy, you should ask ChatGPT, how much energy did it take for my answers?
I was just going to ask what your thoughts, since you played with ChatGPT, artificial intelligence. How much is it limited by the people who are writing the algorithms that create ChatGPT?
That's my big concern on. I think that's very dependent. It's very biased. Like when one of the first experiments with ChatGPT, not ChatGPT, but artificial intelligence, was that Google came out, and they were asked. There were some examples where they said, draw some, you know, kind of create some caricatures of Vikings, and it came out all black people onto it, and saying, okay, there's a bias that is in that information, and how, you know, where is that bias really going to take to it? And when you get the information, how do you know what biases are coming up to? And when I asked ChatGPT the questions, it's saying, what is it? What is that? You know, because there's going to be some biases in that information, just like you're doing somebody doing research, you're going to find, you know, differing views onto it. And one of the things with research is trying to figure out what's more believable, not believable, things like that. And it's not always black and white on the answers. And so it's kind of scary. And I'm glad I'm the age that I am rather than 20 under that type of thing with some of that. And I looked at the grandkids and looked at that. But I guess my parents would have said the same thing. I'm looking at onto, you know, with computers and all that and how that's changed. But so any other thoughts like that? So been kind of an interesting discussion. I don't know, was that
That's sort of, I think one thing, sort of kind of interesting what's going on in California right now. A little off subject, but with gas, okay? It's like, hey, we hate the oil company, we hate the oil companies. They're like, hey, we're shutting refineries down. It's like, oh, you can drill here again, you know, we'll make nice. All of a sudden, you know, now that they're facing a 20% reduction in refineries over the next 2 years, now we're friends with the oil company and can go drilling. And here's the part about it. I don't know if anybody's ever been to Kern County. It's ugly as all get out. And oil production is down 50%. Where's the oil coming from? Rainforest in Ecuador.
Yep.
Oh, that's, hey, look at us. We're so cool. We lowered our, you know, Kern County, 50% less production. It's ugliest place you'll ever want to be, but let's go.
Yep.
Grab some oil out of Ecuador and bring it on up. So, but it's, you know, but they're gonna have a huge issue there.
Yep. Like that, so. Any other last comments?
Yeah, thank you.
Ada?
Enjoyed it a lot.
Okay, thank you.
Just a reminder, this program and all of our lifelong learning programs are an effort of the Friends of the Charlevoix Public Library. And membership in the Friends can help for this to continue, as well as purchases of the used book sale. And we also have some very big donors, the Rosenthals, Lynn and Mason Rosenthal, who have put in a considerable amount of money to help us fund these programs and the Great Decision programs, which are purchased through a national organization that helps us with that. But if you're at all interested in becoming a member or a contributor to the Friends, we have some of the membership envelopes right up here in the corner. Come see us. Thank you all for coming, and thank you so much, Tom, for
Yep.
what you do.
Is my wife here. She's working on setting up a Jamaican Heritage and Reggae Center in Wilmington, Delaware. So my latest endeavor. And so I call this one my cousin Ziggy because she's Bob Marley's cousin. So things like that. So that's the plug for if you're ever in Delaware, kind of look up the Jamaican Heritage Center. So that's what she's trying to get off the ground. So that's my.
It's fun.
I can't sing. My grandkids pay me not to sing.
Yeah.
So.
Very good. Well, thank you all again.
Let me get one of your articles, or what that, tell us what this article was again.
Well, it just kind of takes, it's a kind of a viewpoint talking about, want to take a look at